Shaq walked into court expecting a fair trial. Instead, Judge Lawrence chuckled, rolled his eyes, and mocked him in front of everyone. "Do you even know what a courtroom is, Mr. O'Neill?" he sneered. Laughter broke out. Even the prosecutor smirked. Most people would have been humiliated. Shaq? He folded his arms and smiled. Because he wasn't just ready. He came to play chess. What happened next exposed corruption at the highest level, flipped the courtroom upside down, and ended a judge's career live in front of the world. Stay till the end, because this isn't just a legal battle. It's a masterclass in revenge. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The heavy wooden courtroom doors creaked open, and all heads turned. In stepped Big Shaq, broad-shouldered, calm, and towering above the crowd like a statue carved from solid granite. Whispers rippled across the gallery as phones slid out of pockets and camera flashes sparked. But no one whispered louder than the look on Judge Lawrence's face, a smug grin already tugging at the corner of his mouth. From behind the bench, Judge Lawrence chuckled lowly and leaned toward his mic. "Well, well, Mr. O'Neill graces us with his presence. Tell me, do you even know what a courtroom is, or are you here to sign autographs?" A few snickers echoed from the prosecution's table. Opposing counsel, a thin man with slick-back hair, smirked as if he'd already won, but Shaq didn't flinch. He walked slowly to the defense table, placed a massive hand on the back of the chair, and slid it out with effortless control. His movements were quiet, but his presence was thunder. Michelle Carter, Shaq's attorney, leaned in and whispered tightly, "Shaq, that judge isn't taking this seriously. He's mocking you. We might have a problem." Shaq adjusted his cufflinks, eyes never leaving Judge Lawrence. "Nah," he said calmly, cracking the faintest grin. "He has a problem. He just doesn't know it yet." The judge cleared his throat, tapping his gavel once. Not out of order, but out of amusement. "Let's not waste the court's time. This is a zoning violation, not a press conference." He leaned forward, his smile widening, as if he was already drafting the guilty verdict in his mind. "Let's see if you can keep up, Mr. O'Neill." The courtroom paused, waiting for Shaq to respond with confusion or silence. Instead, Shaq slowly folded his arms across his chest. The room seemed to shrink under the weight of his stare. "No," he said evenly. "Let's see if you can." For a second, you could hear a pin drop. Even the court stenographer stopped typing. Judge Lawrence blinked, thrown slightly off balance. But he quickly masked it behind a forced smirk. Michelle smiled for the first time that morning. The judge straightened his robe, clearing his throat. "Then let the games begin." But deep down, he already knew. He'd underestimated the wrong man. The gavel hadn't even cooled from its last slam when Judge Lawrence leaned forward, clearly impatient. "Let's get this moving. We don't have all day," he barked, barely glancing at the case file in front of him. Michelle Carter stood confidently to begin her opening remarks. "Your Honor, this case is built on a misinterpretation of zoning ordinances that—" "Ms. Carter," Judge Lawrence interrupted, waving his hand dismissively, "spare us the lecture. This isn't a constitutional debate." Across the room, the prosecutor chuckled under his breath. His grin wasn't hidden. It was a smirk of someone who already knew the outcome. He didn't even bother organizing his notes. Why would he? The judge had already picked a side. Shaq sat silently at the defense table, his broad shoulders relaxed but his gaze razor-sharp. His eyes moved from the judge to the smirking prosecutor, then back to the courtroom gallery, where a few reporters sat, bored and scrolling on their phones. No one expected anything dramatic, just a celebrity zoning violation, nothing more. Michelle glanced at Shaq, whispering quickly, "They're steamrolling us." He's not even pretending to be neutral. Shaq didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned slightly toward her, voice calm and low. "That charity center I built? It feeds 200 families a week, helps kids with after-school tutoring. But to them, it's just paperwork." Michelle nodded. "We'll fight this. The law's on our side." But Shaq wasn't done watching. Something in his expression shifted. Less frustration, more calculation. The courtroom's energy felt different now, like a tide pulling back before a wave. The judge cleared his throat and flipped a page. "Mr. Williams, you're opening." The prosecutor stood, oozing confidence. "Your Honor, this is a simple case. Mr. O'Neill failed to adhere to Section 24B of the Municipal Code, which clearly restricts—" Shaq tuned out the rest. He'd read that code the night before, twice, and he already knew the trap being set. Michelle was ready to object, but Shaq gently tapped her elbow. Let him talk, he said, eyes narrowing. The prosecutor wrapped up with a smug nod to the judge, who smiled back like they were sharing an inside joke. Michelle turned to Shaq. He's got the judge in his pocket. Shaq smiled for the first time that day. He leaned in and whispered, just loud enough for Michelle to hear, "They think I'm stupid. Let's have some fun." The courtroom had settled into its rhythm, predictable, tilted, routine. Judge Lawrence leaned back with a smirk, already assuming the day would end with a verdict against the celebrity who thought he could play lawyer. But that rhythm shattered the moment Big Shaq slowly stood up from his chair. The room fell still. Even Michelle looked surprised. "Shaq?" Shaq didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He simply turned to face the bench, towering in stature but speaking with calm precision. "Your Honor, may I ask the court a simple question?" Judge Lawrence scoffed. "Mr. O'Neill, this is not a Q&A. But fine, go ahead. Humor us." Shaq gave a single nod, his gaze never leaving the judge. "Are you familiar with the zoning ordinance in Section 24B, specifically the exemption clause in paragraph 6? The judge blinked. A flicker of hesitation crossed his face. It lasted less than a second, but Shaq caught it. "You mean the clause that allows exemptions for nonprofit community outreach centers built within economically disadvantaged districts?" Shaq continued, holding up a crisp copy of the city code. "The one that was revised last year, under your recommendation?" A murmur rippled through the gallery. Michelle sat straighter, her eyes wide. Judge Lawrence shifted in his seat. "That clause doesn't apply to you." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Doesn't apply? According to city records, the center qualifies under every requirement. You signed off on the update yourself." He tapped the document lightly. "It's public record." The prosecutor leaned forward, suddenly uneasy. Michelle smiled. Shaq turned slightly, addressing both the bench and the gallery. "See, I knew walking in here that I'd be underestimated. That's fine. I'm used to that. But this case isn't about me. It's about using the law to help people and making sure people in power don't twist it when it suits them." The judge opened his mouth, but no words came. Shaq held the silence. "You called me out for not knowing how a courtroom works. But the real question is, do you?" A hush fell over the entire room. Every eye was on Judge Lawrence now. His fingers tapped nervously on the bench. For the first time all morning, the judge didn't look amused. He looked cornered. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Mr. O'Neill," Judge Lawrence snapped, "you're out of your depth. This isn't a basketball court." The gallery chuckled, but it was nervous now, not joyful. The atmosphere had shifted. Shaq didn't move, didn't blink. His towering frame stayed relaxed, arms crossed as he stared down the man behind the bench. Shaq's voice cut through the tension like a knife. Calm, even, lethal. "So if I prove I didn't break the law, will you apologize?" A pause. The judge scoffed, but it was weaker than before. "You won't." Shaq turned slightly to his lawyer, Michelle, who simply nodded. Without a word, Shaq reached into his folder and pulled out a neatly stapled packet of papers. The courtroom leaned forward. No one dared speak. "These," Shaq said, "are permits from the city, signed, stamped, approved, for my charity center, issued 3 weeks before construction even began." He handed them to the bailiff, who brought them to the bench. Judge Lawrence took the papers reluctantly. His expression tightened as he flipped through the pages. Shaq wasn't done. "And here's an email," he added, pulling out another sheet, "from your office, confirming that no zoning violations existed, dated 6 months ago." The courtroom collectively inhaled. The prosecutor leaned in, eyes scanning the papers now in front of the judge. His face lost all color. He looked at Shaq like he was seeing him for the first time. Michelle couldn't help but whisper, "Boom." The judge cleared his throat. "These documents may have been misfiled." Shaq tilted his head. "Or maybe they were ignored. On purpose." Whispers erupted in the gallery. A woman in the front row pulled out her phone and began texting furiously. The sound of camera shutters followed. Judge Lawrence's face flushed with color. His fingers trembled slightly as he handed the documents back. "You still think I'm out of my depth?" Shaq asked quietly. The prosecutor leaned over to whisper something into the judge's ear, his voice urgent. But the judge didn't respond. His hands were frozen. His trap had failed, and everyone knew it. The silence in the courtroom was deafening, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. All eyes were locked on Shaq as he calmly reached into his briefcase. "You see," he said, holding up a thick, sealed envelope with the city's crest stamped across it. "I came prepared." The prosecutor flinched as Shaq handed the envelope to Michelle, who passed it to the bailiff. The courtroom watched the slow, deliberate walk to the bench. Judge Lawrence adjusted his robe, feigning composure, but the tremble in his fingers betrayed him. "What is this?" the judge asked. "Official documentation," Shaq replied smoothly, "from the Department of Urban Planning. Includes zoning maps, inspection clearance, and full approval for my charity center. Signed by the city manager and time-stamped before we broke ground." The judge's eyes darted across the papers. His face stiffened. Beads of sweat gathered at his temple. Gasps erupted from the gallery. One juror leaned forward in disbelief. The opposing attorney leaned back like someone had just knocked the wind out of him. Michelle leaned in, her voice just loud enough for the gallery to hear. "Should we call the city clerk to testify next, or will this be enough?" Judge Lawrence's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Shaq stepped forward, the low rumble of his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Your Honor," he said, slow and deliberate, "would you like to read that out loud for the record, or should I?" The judge didn't answer. His hand hovered above the page. One look into his eyes and the whole room saw it. He knew he'd been caught. "Looks like that bogus charity center was legal after all," Shaq added. Every I dotted, every T crossed. A woman in the gallery pulled out her phone, discreetly recording. Reporters whispered in the back row. The energy in the room shifted, like a tide turning. The prosecutor slumped in his seat, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. He avoided Shaq's gaze like it burned. "Objection!" the prosecutor finally blurted, desperate. "This should have been submitted earlier." Michelle raised an eyebrow. "It was. Your office received a copy last month. Page 3, bottom left corner. Your initials." The judge's gavel twitched in his grip but didn't move. He couldn't dismiss it. He couldn't refute it. He could only sit there, sweating, silent, and exposed. But Shaq? He was just getting started. The courtroom felt like it was sitting on a ticking bomb, and Shaq had just lit the fuse. Judge Lawrence's hands hovered above the evidence Shaq submitted, but he didn't speak. His face flushed with heat, jaw clenched so tight it seemed ready to crack. He cleared his throat and slammed his gavel once. "Let's move on," he muttered. Shaq's voice, calm but sharp, cut through the air. "Nah, Your Honor. Let's stay on topic. You said I broke zoning laws. That right there," he pointed to the folder, "says otherwise." The crowd murmured. Even the jury leaned forward, locked in. Michelle stood silently beside Shaq, her eyes fixed on the judge like a chess player about to call checkmate. The judge's eyes darted to the gallery. Phones were out. Reporters scribbled notes. Cameras pointed directly at his face. His control over the room was slipping fast, and he knew it. With a sudden burst, the gavel came down like thunder. "Mr. O'Neill, you are in contempt of court." Gas shot through the courtroom like gunfire. A few people stood. A reporter's pen dropped with a loud clink. Shaq didn't move. "Contempt?" Michelle's voice rang out. "Contempt for what? Correcting a false claim with evidence?" The judge's nostrils flared. "You're disrupting my courtroom." "No, sir," Michelle said, stepping forward, her voice unwavering. "You're losing control of it." Shaq folded his arms, unbothered. "This isn't a basketball court, Your Honor. But if it was, you just fouled out." A ripple of shocked laughter moved through the gallery, quickly stifled. The judge's eyes burned with humiliation. "Remove them from this courtroom," he barked at the bailiff. But the bailiff, who had stood quietly in the back the entire trial, didn't move. His eyes flicked between Shaq and the judge, hesitation plain on his face. Michelle leaned toward Shaq and whispered, "He knows what's happening." Everyone does. Judge Lawrence looked around the room and saw it too. The gallery no longer respected him. His authority, once unquestioned, was unraveling before a sea of eyes and flashing lenses. Just then, one of the news cameras zoomed in tight, capturing every bead of sweat on the judge's brow. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. The man who once ruled the room was now cornered, and Shaq wasn't done yet. The judge's gavel still echoed faintly as the courtroom simmered in the stunned silence. Shaq stood tall and calm in the eye of the storm, arms folded like he had all the time in the world. Judge Lawrence fumbled with his papers, clearly trying to regain control, but Shaq wasn't finished, not even close. Without a word, Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The courtroom collectively held its breath. He casually dialed a number, his voice low but clear. "Yeah, it's time. Come in." The judge narrowed his eyes. "Mr. O'Neill, this is a courtroom, not a stage. For theatrics." Shaq didn't even look at him. "You'll want to sit for this part." As if on cue, the double doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. Every head turned. In stepped a sharply dressed figure in a navy blue tailored suit, silver tie, briefcase in hand. The air shifted. Gasps rippled through the room. It was Thomas Levingston, one of the most feared and respected legal minds in the country. Former federal prosecutor, Harvard law graduate. The man had argued and won in front of the Supreme Court. And now, he was walking straight toward Shaq. The judge's face turned a shade paler than the paper in front of him. His mouth twitched like he wanted to object, but no words came. Thomas set his briefcase down, nodded respectfully to the court, and turned to Shaq. "Mr. O'Neill," he said calmly, "shall we begin?" Shaq grinned. "Let's." Michelle, Shaq's original attorney, stepped aside without hesitation. This wasn't about ego. It was about firepower, and Levingston brought enough to level the whole courthouse. The judge tried to recover. "Mr. Levingston, you were not previously listed as counsel?" Thomas cut him off, his tone polite but steel-edged. "Emergency substitution, filed electronically before I walked in. I assume the court reads its own dockets?" The courtroom laughed, quietly, nervously. But the message was clear. The power dynamic had just shifted. Shaq leaned on the table and whispered loud enough for the first row to hear. "See? They thought I came alone." The judge looked like he'd just swallowed glass. He opened his mouth to object again, but Thomas was already unlocking his briefcase. And what he was about to pull out would end the judge's career for good. The tension in the courtroom felt like a taut rope. One wrong word and it might snap. Judge Lawrence adjusted his robe, trying to hide the beads of sweat forming along his hairline. His gavel rested unused beside him, powerless in this moment. Thomas Levingston stood at the center like a general preparing for battle. Calm, calculated, deadly. "Your Honor," he began, reaching into his briefcase. "Before we continue, I'd like to introduce something that may impact the court's credibility in this matter." Judge Lawrence sat up straighter, trying to project authority he no longer had. "Mr. Levingston, if this is another delay tactic—" "It's not," Thomas said, pulling out a thick manila folder and laying it gently on the table. He flipped it open and turned a page toward the bench. "This is a certified transcript from a disciplinary hearing held 2 years ago concerning a zoning dispute in Bellevue County." Lawrence's jaw tensed. "Objection!" the prosecutor blurted out, clearly rattled. "That's irrelevant." Thomas raised a hand. "If the judge's past misconduct involves the same type of violation Mr. O'Neill is being accused of today, it's not just relevant. It's vital." Gasps murmured through the courtroom. Michelle leaned in to whisper to Shaq. "He's doing it. He's really doing it," Thomas continued. "Judge Lawrence, in that hearing, you were accused of suppressing zoning clearance evidence for a small business in a low-income neighborhood. The case was mysteriously dismissed until an anonymous complaint reopened the review." "I was cleared of that," Lawrence said quickly, his voice shaking. Thomas turned another page. "You were not. The board chose not to pursue further action due to lack of media attention and public harm, but the misconduct was documented." More murmurs. The jury's eyes darted toward each other. The prosecutor looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. "And now," Thomas said, locking eyes with the judge, "we're seeing the same pattern. A baseless zoning claim, a rushed fine, a lack of due process, and conveniently, a defendant who happens to be opening a center in a low-income area." Judge Lawrence's lips parted, but no words came out. Shaq stood slowly, folding his arms. "This what justice looks like now? Rich men silencing help for poor kids?" The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Thomas delivered the final blow. "Motion to disqualify Judge Lawrence on the grounds of bias and judicial misconduct, and I'm filing a formal complaint with the Judicial Review Board." A gasp echoed from the back row. A reporter sprinted out the courtroom doors. The story had just gone public, and Judge Lawrence knew. His career might be over by sundown. The silence was louder than any gavel slam. Judge Lawrence's hands trembled as he gripped the bench, knuckles pale. The courtroom no longer felt like his. The energy had shifted. Eyes weren't on Shaq anymore. They were on him, and they weren't kind. In the jury box, A low hum of whispers buzzed between jurors. One woman leaned toward another and mouthed, "Can he even stay on this case?" Another man shook his head slowly, lips tight in disbelief. Their faces said everything. Trust was gone. The prosecutor stood stiffly, arms crossed, but the sweat on his brow betrayed him. He wasn't defending a case anymore. He was defending himself for being part of it. His glance toward Judge Lawrence wasn't confident. It was panicked. At the defense table, Shaq sat like a statue, calm, composed, but you could feel the heat behind his stare. He slowly stood, his voice rumbling with quiet intensity. Now, about that apology. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't even a question. It was a challenge. The judge didn't respond right away. His eyes flicked around the courtroom, desperately searching for an ally. But everyone had stepped back. Even the bailiff looked uncomfortable. Lawrence reached for his gavel, then stopped, his hand hovering. His breathing was shallow. Thomas Livingston's words from earlier still echoed in the air. Motion to disqualify on grounds of judicial misconduct. Michelle leaned toward Shaq. "He's unraveling," she whispered. "He knows he's finished." Lawrence tried to speak. This court." He cleared his throat, but the words refused to cooperate. His voice cracked like brittle glass. Shaq didn't move, just kept his eyes locked on him. "You judged me before I said a word. You mocked me on record. And now? You're exposed." The judge's fingers twitched at the edge of his bench. And then he stood up. Without a word, he walked down from the bench, his robe swaying stiffly behind him. The courtroom gasped. One juror covered her mouth. A reporter scribbled furiously. The cameras zoomed in. Judge Lawrence didn't look at anyone as he exited through a side door, his steps echoing like the final ticks of a broken clock. As the heavy door shut behind him, Thomas turned to the room and announced, "Your Honor has just vacated the bench. This trial, it's over. For him." The courthouse doors burst open, and the flashbulbs followed instantly. Dozens of reporters swarmed the steps, microphones extended like weapons, all pointing at one man. Big Shaq stepped out calmly, dressed in a charcoal suit, flanked by his powerhouse attorney Michelle Carter and legal legend Thomas Livingston. His expression? A quiet mix of pride and restraint, like a man who knew the storm had just passed, and he was still standing. "Mr. O'Neill, did you expect today's outcome? What do you say to people who called this a publicity stunt?" "Shaq, how did you really know the zoning law better than a sitting judge?" Shaq paused, glanced toward the cameras, then slowly cracked a smile. "Easy," he said, his voice deep and deliberate. "I did my homework." The crowd of reporters erupted with follow-up questions. Flashbulbs popped. Social media live streams were blowing up. Hashtags like "One sure Shaq flipped the court" and "Our Judge Lawrence exposed" were already trending. Inside the courthouse, chaos hadn't stopped. The Judicial Review Board had already requested a formal transcript of the trial. Emails were flying between oversight committees. An emergency ethics inquiry had been scheduled for Judge Lawrence. He hadn't even made it to his chambers before his phone lit up with notification after notification. Meanwhile, back on the steps, Michelle leaned into the mic. "We came here expecting a fair hearing. We didn't get one. But thanks to truth and a client who refused to be underestimated, we took one." A news anchor from Channel 6 said into her mic, "It's official. Shaq just turned a courtroom ambush into a legal reckoning." One reporter raised his voice. "Shaq, what would you say to the judge now?" Shaq looked straight into the camera lens. "I'd say this. Never mistake silence for ignorance, and never think size means I won't outthink you." Laughter rippled through the press. Michelle nodded with a satisfied smirk. Thomas added, "This wasn't just a win for Shaquille O'Neal. This was a message to every courtroom that justice isn't reserved for the powerful. It belongs to the prepared." As the reporters shouted more questions, a network producer's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and her eyes widened. She looked at her cameraman. "Cut to the studio. Now the judge is officially under judicial investigation. This isn't over." The courtroom sat cold and empty, but the headlines were burning. That evening, the Judicial Review Board issued a rare emergency bulletin. Investigation launched into Judge Harold Lawrence for alleged misconduct and abuse of authority. News anchors delivered the breaking update with urgency, images flashing across the screen. Shaq standing tall, the judge ducking into a car, surrounded by reporters. Inside the review board's chambers the next morning, Judge Lawrence sat at a long table beneath harsh fluorescent lights. His usual confidence was gone. His robe had been replaced with a stiff suit, his tone stripped of arrogance. What remained was a man unraveling under pressure. A stern female board member leaned in. Judge Lawrence, you're being investigated for bias, suppression of due process, and an attempt to override zoning law to penalize a legally approved nonprofit. Do you deny these claims? Lawrence cleared his throat. I misinterpreted some filings. The defendant, Mr. O'Neill, was grandstanding. It clouded judgment. Another board member flipped a page in the folder. You mean the same judgment that dismissed city-approved permits and cut off legal counsel mid-argument? Lawrence's voice cracked. This is being blown out of proportion. Then came the twist. Thomas Livingston, Shaq's legal legend, had submitted new documentation, prior cases where Lawrence had dismissed evidence without cause. Suddenly a pattern was forming, one that couldn't be ignored. Back in Shaq's team office, the former basketball star watched the proceedings live from a private stream. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Michelle looked at him. You think they'll remove him? Shaq didn't blink. They don't have a choice. The board returned after deliberation. The lead investigator spoke clearly into the mic. Due to the overwhelming evidence of judicial misconduct, Judge Harold Lawrence is hereby suspended indefinitely pending formal removal proceedings. Gasps rippled through the small press room. Lawrence sank into his chair, defeated. Outside, Shaq stepped into the sunlight as cameras swarmed. One reporter shouted, Shaq, how does it feel knowing you just took down a judge? He paused, then said, I didn't take him down. He did that himself. I just made sure the world saw it. The sun cast golden light across the newly painted sign, the O'Neill Community Center, open to all. Beneath it, laughter echoed as children burst through the front doors for the very first time, some still holding on to their parents, others running straight for the basketball court or the free computer lab. Shaq stood near the entrance in a crisp gray suit, hands in his pockets, a quiet smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The crowd behind him clapped, cheered, and snapped photos, but his eyes were locked on the kids. They were the reason he fought this fight. Michelle Carter approached, clipboard in hand. The permits just cleared. All of them. Fully approved. It's official, Shaq. He nodded. Took long enough. Worth it, she added. Reporters swarmed closer now, their cameras aimed, microphones extended. Shaq, any words for Judge Lawrence? Shaq shook his head, looking out at the kids playing on the brand new playground equipment. This was never about him, he said, voice steady. It was about making sure kids from this neighborhood had what I didn't growing up, opportunity. A little girl ran up, tugging on his blazer. Mr. Shaq, is it true you built this for us? He crouched down, his towering frame folding gently. Built it with you in mind, yeah. You gonna come here every day? She nodded hard. Every day after school. He grinned and bumped her fist. Then it was worth every second. Just behind the crowd, a man in a faded suit watched silently from his car. Judge Lawrence. Disgraced, disbarred, discarded. He turned off the radio. It was broadcasting Shaq's speech live. With trembling hands, he rolled up his window and drove off, swallowed by silence. Meanwhile, inside the center, murals painted by local artists covered the walls. One of them showed a towering figure lifting a community on his shoulders. Kids stood in awe beneath it. Michelle leaned over to Shaq. You really think this will change anything? Shaq's eyes didn't leave the crowd of smiling faces. It already did. As the ribbon fluttered to the ground and the door swung wide open, one headline lit up every screen across the country. One judge tried to shut him down. Shaq built a legacy instead.